Millionaire's son, kept failing every exam until the maid taught him what schools never did. Ethan was the only son of a powerful millionaire, a boy who grew up in luxury surrounded by every privilege money could buy. He had private tutors, the most elite schools, and endless resources at his fingertips. Yet, despite all of this, Ethan kept failing every single exam that came his way. His father grew more and more frustrated, unable to understand how his son, who had every advantage, could not succeed academically. Teachers whispered that he was lazy, classmates mocked him as the dumbest boy in the richest family, and Ethan himself started to believe he was hopeless. The weight of expectation crushed him, and the harder his father pushed, the more Ethan's grades collapsed. He felt invisible inside his own home, where money could solve everything, except his pain. One evening, after receiving yet another failing report card, Ethan sat alone in the living room, head buried in his arms. That's when Rosa, the family maid, quietly entered. She had watched Ethan struggle for years, but this was the first time she dared to step closer. Rosa wasn't highly educated, yet her wisdom came from life itself. She asked softly, "Do you really understand the things you're studying?" Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with tears, and admitted that he never understood. He only memorized words he couldn't connect with. Rosa gave him a gentle smile and said, "Schools teach books, but not always meaning. Let me show you another way." From that moment, things began to change. Rosa taught him differently, not with lectures or pressure, but with patience and real-life lessons. Math became slicing a cake into equal parts. History turned into stories told by candlelight, and science came alive in the kitchen while cooking. Ethan slowly began to see knowledge as something living, something that connected to the world around him. His eyes lit up with curiosity, and for the first time, he asked questions not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Rosa treated him not as a failure, but as someone with potential waiting to be unlocked. Day by day, Ethan grew stronger, his confidence returning with every small victory. Soon, the boy who once hid his face from books began teaching others in class, stunning his teachers and silencing his bullies. When his final exams arrived, he surprised everyone by not just passing, but excelling. His father, shocked by the transformation, asked the expensive tutors what miracle they had performed. But Ethan stood tall and answered proudly, "It wasn't them, it was Rosa." His father turned to the maid with wide eyes, realizing that the woman he had overlooked all these years had given his son something that no amount of money could buy: patience, wisdom, and belief. Ethan's journey showed that true education is not found in wealth or in prestigious schools, but in understanding, kindness, and the courage to learn differently. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the red marks all over his report card, tears streaming down his face as he tried to hold back the lump in his throat. He had failed once again, and the shame felt heavier than ever. His father's angry words echoed in his mind, the disappointment of being a millionaire's son who could not pass a simple exam, crushing his spirit. As he buried his face in his hands, Rosa, the family's maid, walked in quietly to tidy the room. She had seen Ethan struggle for years, but this time, the sight of the boy broken and defeated pulled at her heart. Instead of walking away, she sat down gently beside him and asked in her calm voice, "Ethan, do you really understand what you are studying?" Her question startled him, because no one had ever asked that before. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, then confessed through shaky words that he never truly understood anything in his books. He only memorized page after page, repeating them like a machine, hoping that it would be enough to please his teachers and his father. But deep down, the knowledge never stayed, and the pressure to perform only made him fail again and again. Rosa gave a small smile, her eyes kind but firm, and she told him, "Schools may give you books, but they don't always give you meaning. Let me show you another way." That night marked the beginning of a new journey for Ethan, one he never expected would come from the maid everyone overlooked. Rosa began teaching him, not like the strict tutors who barked orders, but like a patient friend who cared for his growth. She didn't force him to memorize lines or sit for hours in frustration. Instead, she broke down every lesson into things Ethan could see, touch, and relate to. Math was no longer confusing numbers on a page. It became something real when she cut an apple into halves and quarters, showing him fractions in a way he could taste and understand. History wasn't just boring dates anymore. It turned into fascinating stories she told in the evenings, tales of kings, wars, and inventions that came alive in his imagination. Science wasn't a list of complicated words. It became experiments. In the kitchen, where boiling water turned to steam and frying oil explained reactions better than any textbook ever could. For the first time, Ethan's eyes lit up with curiosity. He began to ask questions eagerly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to know more. He laughed when he understood a concept, a sound Rosa said was more rewarding than any grade. Slowly, his confidence returned, and the boy who once hid from books started picking them up with interest. Rosa had given him more than knowledge. She had given him the courage to believe that he wasn't stupid, that he was capable of learning in his own way. Ethan realized that true teaching wasn't about expensive tutors or memorizing lines. It was about understanding, patience, and a guide who cared enough to show him meaning where others only showed him pressure. That night, the bond between a millionaire's struggling son and a humble maid grew stronger than ever, and Ethan's life began to change forever. Ethan's days slowly began to look different. Where he once dreaded the sight of his books, now he looked at them with a new sense of curiosity. Rosa had taken away the fear that weighed on him and replaced it with a spark of excitement. She showed him that lessons were not locked inside the pages of textbooks, but alive in the world around him. When she wanted him to understand fractions, she brought a cake to the table and cut it into halves, then quarters, letting him see and taste what the numbers meant. When he struggled with history, she didn't make him memorize endless dates. Instead, she told him stories, weaving tales of kings and battles and discoveries that sounded more exciting than any novel. Ethan found himself leaning forward, wide-eyed, imagining the past unfolding right before him. And when it came to science, Rosa brought him into the kitchen. She let him watch how water turned to steam, how sugar melted into caramel, how oil hissed when it touched heat. Every simple act became an experiment, and Ethan realized that science was not just about hard words but about the world he lived in every day. The more Rosa taught, the more Ethan's confidence grew. For the first time in his life, he was able to solve problems on his own. He began connecting ideas, explaining things out loud, and sometimes even teaching Rosa back the way he understood them. His laughter returned, and so did his sense of worth. Ethan no longer felt like the failure his teachers had labeled him as, or the embarrassment his father believed him to be. He started to see himself as someone capable, someone who could learn and grow if only he was taught in a way that made sense. His classmates, who once mocked him for always failing, began to notice that he now raised his hand with answers they couldn't think of. The tutors, who had given up on him, were shocked to see him solving equations and explaining concepts, with a confidence they had never seen before. Rosa's patience was the key that unlocked something hidden inside him. She never scolded him for being slow, never made him feel small for asking questions. Instead, she reminded him that every question was important, that curiosity was the beginning of wisdom. Ethan carried those words like a treasure. Soon, his grades began to rise, each test showing progress that filled him with pride. But beyond the numbers, something greater happened. Ethan began to believe in himself. He realized education wasn't about memorizing words he would forget, but about understanding ideas he could carry with him forever. For the first time, Ethan felt free, not trapped by failure, and all because someone had shown him that learning could be simple, meaningful, and even joyful. His transformation was not just in the classroom, but in his heart, where a new fire had been lit, one that no failure could ever extinguish again. The day of the final exam results arrived, and Ethan sat nervously in his chair, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope that would reveal whether he had succeeded or failed yet again. For years, this moment had always brought him shame and fear, but this time felt different. He could still hear Rosa's voice in his mind reminding him, "Do not fear the result, just remember what you understand." Slowly, his eyes scanned the paper and his heart skipped a beat. He had passed. Not only passed, but achieved marks higher than anyone had ever expected from him. The boy who once carried the title of failure now had proof that he was capable, and in that instant, relief and pride washed over him like never before. When the news spread, his classmates who had mocked him were stunned into silence. Teachers, who had dismissed him as hopeless, exchanged glances of disbelief. And at home, his father, the millionaire who had spent fortunes on tutors and elite schools, sat in shock as he stared at his son's grades. For the first time, the old man's eyes softened, a mix of confusion and pride fighting within him. He called in the expensive tutors, demanding to know what method they had finally used to make Ethan succeed, but they admitted they had nothing to do with it. That was the moment Ethan stood tall, a quiet strength in his voice, and declared, "It wasn't them. It was Rosa." Silence filled the room as his father turned to look at the maid who had been dusting shelves in the corner, never seeking attention or recognition. Rosa froze, unsure of what to say, but Ethan continued, explaining how she had taught him not through memorization or pressure, but through patience, stories, and real-life lessons that finally made learning meaningful. The millionaire was speechless. For years he had looked at Rosa as just a servant, someone invisible in the grand halls of his mansion. Yet here she stood, revealed as the person who had given his son what all his money, power, and status could not: understanding, confidence, and a genuine love of learning. Slowly, the father's pride gave way to humility as he realized he had been wrong to measure education only in wealth. He approached Rosa with gratitude, his voice heavy with emotion, and thanked her for saving his son not just from failure, but from a lifetime of self-doubt. From that day on, Ethan's journey became an example for everyone around him. He was no longer defined by the word failure, but by his resilience and the hidden mentor who believed in him. He learned that true education does not come from luxury or prestigious institutions, but from guidance that speaks to the heart. Rosa had shown him that the greatest teachers are not always the ones with titles or degrees, but the ones who care enough to ignite curiosity and build confidence. Ethan carried this lesson with him forever, promising himself that no matter how successful he became, he would never forget the maid who taught him what schools never did.